Welcome back, friends. This evening I'm at the river, going to do some gar fishing. Got a new spinning lure. I'll show you this thing from Bass Pro Shops. I think it'll work pretty well. Basically, big spinning lures have been really successful in catching gar. I bought this lure at Bass Pro Shops. I picked up the lure, I went to pay for it, and I pulled out my credit card. The credit card, I take this for granted. Most people do take this little piece of plastic we carry around with us all the time for granted. But I also use it for almost every single purchase that I make. This is likely one of the easiest ways of buying things that's pretty much ever existed. So the question is, how do we get to this point, and why do we call this a credit card anyway? That is what we're going to talk about today.
So we're going to go way back. Well, we're not going to go way back because credit comes from, good grief, we've had credit just about as long as we've had history at all. So I'm going to skip the history of money and the history of lending and borrowing and credit in general. Although in my mind, I can kind of picture cavemen all sitting around a fire and one agreeing to pay for their roast mammoth dinner by gathering some additional wild onions or something tomorrow. So I digress. Anyway, what we're talking about here, we're just talking about borrowing money. So we start out with borrowing money just from merchants. And this gets into where we get a credit card that we have today. We're just going to borrow from a merchant. We'll say, they'll sell me some seeds, some corn seeds. I'm going to borrow corn seeds for the season. I'm going to plant them, grow this wonderful harvest it, and at that point in time, I'll be able to pay the merchant back. That's simple borrowing. It's borrowing from only one single merchant, though. Now, we have to move from the old school borrowing from a merchant, which has probably existed just about as long as we've had money and borrowing specifically, to borrowing from one person to pay multiple merchants and doing it at the point of sale. And that's a big transition. That transition didn't really start happening until the 20th century. So in the greater scheme of history, this is a pretty recent development. So this kind of started almost at the turn of the century. We have merchants developed what we call tokens that identified your account. So these tokens, sometimes they were like coins. A lot of times they were metal plates. Back then, they didn't actually have a lot of plastic, if any plastic at all. They had metal plates, almost looked like a dog tag that had your information and your account information. Basically a copy or a rub of that would seal the sale, and then they would go and collect it. But for the most part, those were merchant specific. Merchants issued these to increase sales. They weren't doing it as a profit center in of itself. It wasn't a standalone business. It was just a means by which they could increase their sales at their establishment. So we didn't start having this setup, this credit, this purchasing as a standalone business until we basically got the Diners Club, which Diners Club, as the name implies, started out as a diners club. It was a group of restaurants, actually in New York and LA, I believe, who agreed to accept this card that was the Diners card. Now, the Diners Club card allowed an individual holding that card to purchase at multiple agreeing merchants. However, they still had to pay it off every period, or basically every 30 days or every month. So it was what's referred to more as a charge card and less so as a credit card. So that was the Diners Club. That's the first thing that we can look back and see that looks very similar to our credit cards today. It was a standalone company with the goal of making money through the charge card, not just by increasing or generating more sales. So how do we get from the charge card or the Diners Club card to our current credit card? So that didn't happen until basically the mid to late 1950s. Banks started to enter the scene. They saw the profitability of this charge card. They start entering the scene and providing credit across merchants. So this, from a merchant standpoint, it looks very similar to the charge card, but banks are now doing it. Now, this was a big transition for banks who had primarily been focused on industrial, commercial lending, not consumer lending. This is the modern charge card is born out of this process. Some of our major issuers initially, Bank of America, who's still around today, who started out in California, they had one of the first large-scale credit cards as we know it today. Now, these looked very similar. However, we lacked the automation that we have with credit cards today, where we have magnetic chips, or now we've moved on to chips embedded in the card, and we'll be moving on past that. Many times we're paying with our cell phones. It's not even a card anymore. So that's kind of where we where it came from. So why do we call it a credit card? Now, I mentioned initially they were called charge cards because it was a charge that you then paid for, as opposed to credit, which is a loan. Now, the term credit card, ironically, actually comes out of Edward Bellamy's 1888 novel, Looking Backward, 2000 to 1887. So the irony in this is that Bellamy's book is a socialist utopian novel, and the credit card actually functioned a little bit more like debit cards do today, where you kind of had an account set up. Everyone got the same amount of money to spend, and they carried it around on these cards that were then marked off as you used up your credits that you received for the period. So it's kind of interesting, or ironic anyway, that terminology that we use today came out of a socialist utopian novel where there is no credit, no lending, no capitalism at all. That's where the term credit card came from. Anyway, but modern usage has generally linked the term credit card to the fact that you are receiving a credit in the sense that it increases your liabilities. So if you go back to accounting, a credit entry increases your liabilities. And this is actually distinct from a debit card, which reduces the value in your account. So it actually debits your account at the bank. Your account at the bank is actually a liability to the bank. So a debit would decrease the amount the bank owes you in terms of sitting in your, say, checking account. So that's where we kind of get the credit card piece. The card piece is somewhat straightforward. It looks like a card. So that's where it comes from. It'll be interesting to know what do we do when we start just using phones or chips or whatever, embedded chips, if you're a conspiracy theorist at this point. But thus, we've got credit card. The term has stuck for the time being. So anyway, there's a little quick history on credit cards. If you enjoyed this, a little adventure through the history of the credit cards, give me a thumbs up and make sure you subscribe to see future content similar to this, how we explore the accounting and financial world. And also check out my other accounting and finance related content from Accounting Outside. Thanks for watching. Have a great day, and God bless.